everyone, my name is Vera Genevi. I'm an audiologist and a lecturer here at the Division of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. I'm happy to be talking you through the information on language and communication for deaf children. We will systematically answer the following question. Firstly, what is the difference or the link between language and communication? Secondly, what are the challenges associated with language and communication for deaf children? And thirdly, is there a difference between language for communication and language for learning in deaf children? Let's dive into the very first question. Is there a difference or a link between language and communication? To answer this, I would like to quickly run through some of the semantics of the two words, language and communication. Let's start with language. As a word, it is defined as a system or structure of spoken, manual, or written symbols by means of which human beings, as members of a social group and participants in their culture, express themselves. Functionally, language is used to communicate, express, identify, play, imagine, connect, and learn. It is also important to note that language is learned or acquired through passive and active observation based on the presence of particular pre-linguistic skills. To give an example, we are right now using the English system or structure of spoken words to communicate through the platform of technology. This brings me to the second word, communication. Now, communication is defined as an act of transferring, exchanging, imprinting messages or information from one person to another. It can be written, manual, visual, spoken, using the different systems or structures, i.e. the language. If we were to say, is there a difference? Yes. Language is a tool and communication is a process. Is there a link? Yes. We use language as a tool to communicate. Now, inherent in the definition of communication, for it to be successful, we need the transfer of the information between the sender and the receiver to be using the same tool, i.e. the language, in order for them to understand one another. It is key to note that communication does not only happen through one tool. As mentioned in the definition, it can be spoken or signed. And specifically for very young children, it is important to remember that visuals such as pictures, activities such as playing, and other symbols also count as communication or language tools. Now, onto our target population, deaf learners. It is important to understand the distinction as well as the connection between their language and communication, and then consider what would that mean for the educational or learning context in the classroom. The focus of this video is on deaf learners who primarily use sign language and identify culturally as deaf. Therefore, attached to the meaning and understanding of language and communication, it is important in the learning and teaching process to be respectful of sign as a language and as a marker of cultural identity. Let's go on to our second question. What are the challenges associated with language and communication for deaf children? Well, to answer this, we have to look at how does teaching take place in the classroom generally? Well, in most cases, communication and teaching in the classroom is done through spoken and written language. The communication is often structured in a way where the teacher is in front of the class, teaching, and the learners are customarily seated in rows or even groups throughout the class, learning. Now, implied with this kind of example or setting is the use of spoken and written language for teaching. And there we have two challenges for deaf children. One, deaf children cannot hear a speaking teacher. And number two, they do not necessarily always have the literacy skills to follow and understand written language. Now, with deaf children, these are key challenges to confront because the two main challenges are highlighted show the following. One, there may be a language mismatch between the teacher and the learner. And two, literacy development, i.e. reading and writing, is different or takes different timelines in deaf children. Let's look into these challenges one by one. I need to first clarify here that by literacy, I'm referring to the ability to read and write, and I am not negating other forms of literacy such as computer or mathematical literacy. Now, the language mismatch that I identified earlier between the teacher and the signing learner. Unless the learners are in a special school that caters particularly for deaf children, more often than not in South African or other developing contexts, we have hearing teachers that are proficient speaking language users that are teaching deaf signing learners. This presents a language mismatch. This is something that may be present also in the home or in society, as most deaf kids are often born into hearing homes or society. So this language mismatch is a key thing to highlight in the classroom because language is learned through observation. Now, in developing countries like South Africa, not all children receive early intervention. This means that the language mismatch is not just between spoken and signing, but also the children may also have developmental delays in whichever language, including sign. So what I'm highlighting here is that a deaf learner, unlike their hearing peers, is in the classroom presented with the challenge of acquiring a new language, the reading and writing language. And although they may be cognitively and intellectually on par with their age-related mates, they may also not have the age-appropriate communication development necessary for them to efficiently learn in the classroom. This then affects how they learn and therefore affects their academic performance, purely based on the language of instruction. Now, as a result of the struggle in understanding or as a result of the language mismatch, many deaf children may experience practical difficulties such as retaining new information that is taught in the class, paying attention in the class, and number 3 may then be seen as misbehaving. Now on to the second challenge, having a language development delay. This is a challenge because in language and communication with deaf children, early identification and early intervention does not always happen. And if that is not so, their issues with language delays are not resolved before their academic years, and thus affects their academic performance in the classroom. As an educator in the setting with deaf children, the first point of call with the challenge of the language mismatch and possible language delay is to make use of a speech-language therapist and/or audiologist like myself in order to identify the possible language delay and therefore manage appropriately. This will then help you as a teacher or educator to identify adaptations and support mechanisms that you can use for the deaf learner or learners in your classroom to facilitate learning for them and thus overcome the language mismatch. Now on to literacy. Reading and writing development is a second challenge associated with language and communication of deaf children because they also need to learn how to read and write. We understand that for a child to develop literacy skills in general, they need to be taught spoken language in which to learn to read and write. This process inherently implies the ability to hear. Now, if you're a hearing person, I want you to stretch your memory back to how you learned how to read and write your name, for example. It was mostly through repetition of the English alphabet based on how the alphabet sounds. Thereafter, the teachers went through the laborious task of linking that sound to the symbol, which is a letter, which also through repetition, you learned how to draw and eventually properly write on a page. And many months later, you can then read and write your name. Now, this whole learning process is based on hearing. That means for deaf children who sign, acquisition of reading and writing as a skill implies bilingualism because number 1, they need to learn sign language as their primary language. Number 2, they need to learn English as a written language. And number 3, they need to associate the two, hence bilingualism. Now, it is important to note that bilingualism as an experience for any deaf child is difficult, but it is also a difficult and more challenging experience for those that are late identified as deaf children. Now, deaf children are then expected to learn both the signing language as well as the reading and writing language simultaneously, and oftentimes they are past their critical age for learning any new language. It is important to understand that sign language is a language has its own structure and is not a mere translation of English or any other language. The common mistake we make often as a hearing society and often as hearing teachers is to translate lessons into sign and assume that literacy, reading and writing, can occur in the same pathway or timeline with deaf children as it does with their speaking peers. Based on everything I've explained thus far, you will realize it is not so. In teaching a deaf child reading and writing skills, we need to be aware that they are essentially learning three separate things simultaneously. Firstly, to associate a sign to a letter of an alphabet in a different language, which is often English, and this activity is called fingerspelling. This is a visual task for them, and they do not have sound input. It is important to note this because the brain remembers sound much easier and differently than it does visual stimuli. The second thing we're teaching them is to attach meaning to a combination of letters that they now know how to fingerspell into words, and then associate this word to a sign which they may already know. For example, in associating a sign for baby to the word baby that is written as B-A-B-Y, the child needs to first identify that these two semantically mean the same thing, and number two, identify them as the same word, as a reading and writing skill. The third thing that you're also teaching them is a different grammar system and structure. English and other languages, including sign language, have different grammar rules. So in short, a deaf child may be cognitively apt to learn reading and writing skills, but we need to be aware that the learning process and literacy demands are very different when there's an absence of audio input and the brain has to use visual input. I think the most effective way to overcome challenges associated to literacy development in teaching deaf children, you may need to learn sign language. Now we're going to move on to our third big question. What are the differences between language for communication and language for learning for deaf children? The first difference is the formality. In every language, there is a formal and a colloquial version. In everyday exchanges and communication, we use colloquial language, which is also linked to different dialects, different cultures, and different regions. However, in learning, we are most likely to use more formal language that is more generic and standard. Similarly, in sign language with deaf children, there are different dialects and different regions that also subscribe to different subcultures. Now, if you're using sign language in your classroom as a mode of instruction, it is important to be aware that there are smaller and nuanced differences in the language that you may be using in that particular area. And your particular tip would be to use more formal and standard language in the sign. The second key thing that is different in the language we use for communicating versus learning is concepts. Inherent in the process of learning is teaching new things that are often unknown and sometimes non-tangible to a child who is going through learning. Now, sometimes as a result of late identification and limited exposure to early accessible language, many deaf children will lack the general knowledge of vocabulary that their hearing peers would have. Now, in the class, this would mean a little bit extra time would be needed to explain new foundational concept that you're teaching in order to make sure that the content is being followed and not being lost through the teaching of a new concept. Now, to conclude, I would like to highlight what we have covered in this session. We have looked at the differences and the links between language and communication. We have highlighted some challenges in language and communicating with deaf children. And then we've also looked at the differences and some of the key things to look out for between language for communication and language for learning in the classroom. Now, I would like to end off with a quote from Paula Acido to appreciate your passion in teaching deaf learners. And this quote says, "Sometimes the loudest thing in the world is the thing that you cannot hear at all."